And then let me just get a thumbs up from everybody that you can see the screen. Perfect. All right. So while we're getting to know everyone here, what we'd like for you guys to do is drop in the chat things that make you happy and motivated. Like it has to be the same thing, happy and motivated. Everybody's like, You guys are like so deep. Mine was coffee. It was coffee. It makes me happy. And
Well, yeah, I think I couldn't answer the question before coffee. So, coffee is the precursor to everything in my life.
yes, absolutely. And now that we know that I'm the shallow one in the group, I'll really quickly introduce myself. My name is Nisi, and I am a kind of multi-passionate entrepreneur. I have nonprofits and regular for-profit businesses. And so I kind of get to see the world from both lenses and what it looks like. And of course, one of my favorite things to do is educate. And by that, we get to host webinars. So I just want to thank our special guests, and I will let them introduce themselves so they can tell you all the special things about them. Leslie, I'll get started with you.
Sounds good. Yeah, people must be thinking like, why do I come on this webinar and can listen to her? What does she know? So I've worked in the nonprofit sector exclusively for 20 years. I've had a very long and windy road as a career path. I don't use that term because it's really bumpy and not a path. But I've spent more time and had more roles in the nonprofit world than any other work I've ever done. I've worked for big organizations on a national level. I've worked for small local startups. I've sat on both sides of the table too. I've been a board member, the treasurer, the philanthropy chair, the board chair. So I really understand both sides of the table in the nonprofit sector. And today I'm a consultant, and my goal is to share my experience and knowledge to help people be better in the community and achieve their own goals.
Thank you. All right. Yep.
I am happy to introduce myself and delighted to be here for this discussion. We talk about this a lot at LISC, and so I'll give you a little bit of background on LISC first. Local Initiative Support Corporation. So right there, that's what we do. We are supposed to support local initiatives in community development, and a lot of our work focuses on grassroots economic development work and affordable housing. And so we're the San Antonio office. There are about 40 offices nationally, and I'm the executive director here. But I came to this role through a little bit like Leslie, a variety of different roles, but also in different sectors. So I spent a good portion of my career working with local government and working on government relations and getting to understand how that ecosystem looks from that perspective, from the city and the county perspective, and then working at the state as in advocacy. Ordinary people call them lobbyists, but we don't use that word when we're doing local government lobbying, and then also federal government relations work. So, and then sometime in the private sector and doing consulting work for clients. So all around the whole table in terms of how you create a sustainable ecosystem of community partners.
Perfect. And you just jumped us right into our first thing. That was perfect. So I just want to ask you both, what are 3 things that people should know about their local ecosystem before they start a nonprofit?
Do you want to go first? Yeah, Leila, go ahead.
I was just going to throw out the very first one you should always know is who else is doing what you want to do. So you need to understand what the niche is in the local ecosystem and what efforts are already filling that niche.
I would agree with that. I think the other thing is you have to understand the scope of what you're trying to accomplish. So some people say, you know, I really want to help animals. Okay, there's a lot of people out there helping animals. People say, well, I just really want to save those green dogs. And it's, well, how many green dogs are there and do they need to be saved? And then what's the interest in that? What would the funding look like? So I think it's understanding the community at large and how much need is there focused on what you're focused on.
Just to add to that, so a third piece of, maybe this is the third piece. So what's the niche? What are you focused on? And an understanding of your who you're serving, of your client. Or so if you're going to serve green dogs and you know how many green dogs there are out there, what do green dogs need? If you had to sit down with someone and explain, here are the challenges that are very particular to green dogs, and here's how we're going to meet those challenges. We have folks who say, well, I'm going to do affordable housing development. Well, what client are you going to serve? Well, you know, low income folks. Okay, well, that's a very large group. Well, we're going to serve women with children. Okay, at what income level? What other programs are they going to be eligible for? What services are they going to need? You need to have a thorough understanding of the specific client or family or individual, if you don't want to use the word client. I know there's sensitivity around that. Before you create a structure around that. And the other thing I would say is, before you even get to this question, we talk a lot about founder syndrome. We talk about other issues but I think a lot of that comes from a misperception that when you create a nonprofit, it's your nonprofit. When you create a nonprofit, you are creating an entity that serves the community. It is not yours. You are bringing resources together to support the community. And that's the foundational understanding, I think. And I saw Leslie agreeing, so I'm hoping that resonates with her.
You're muted. Can you unmute? Dun, dun, dun.
I have no idea how I muted. Sorry. Yes, I was totally agreeing with you. You took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say, before you even look at the ecosystem that you're, you know, what problem you're trying to solve and who else is solving it in your, and community is one of those broad words. It could be your neighborhood, it could be your city, it could be your county, it could be whatever, right? But you have to understand what a nonprofit is. It has to serve a public purpose. Public purpose. Let me say that one more time. Public purpose. It needs to fulfill an unmet need in the community. Unmet need. Sometimes you think, oh, I want to do this, but it's already a met need. It's being met. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's being met. And again, to underscore what Lila said, it's totally not owned by you if you were the founder. It is managed by a governing body. Once you create a 501c3 or a 501c anything, it is that board, that governing body, that has the ultimate responsibility for it. And then it's also understanding that revenue surpluses, and yes, you can have a revenue surplus that's quote unquote a profit, has to go back into the organization. You can't be like, oh, I did all this great work, I'm going to take that home. Nope. So those are the big things that and I could talk about that whole topic for an hour, but I won't. Go ahead.
Well,
I'll stop now.
And Leslie, I feel like that segue into this, which is perfect. One of the things I think folks are tempted to do is say, oh, well, I'm going to start this nonprofit. I'm going to work for nothing. The board is going to be composed of my friends and family, and we're going to make sure that that's how it's sustainable. But that is not a sustainable model. And I know it's tempting to think, but I think that reinforces this perception. Well, I'm working for nothing. You know, my uncle just gave us $10,000 and that's how we're sustaining our work. And that centers you in the work, as opposed to understanding what is the need and how could this be sustainable if you were hit by a bus. That's our famous, what happens to you if the ED is the only thing, or the CEO is the only thing holding the nonprofit together, then that is not a sustainable organization. And the goal here is not to create something that will flourish for a few years and go away. Because when you engage with community and you commit that you're creating an entity that's going to be a partner with them, and those entities come and go, that's just as disappointing and disruptive as not being able to get a commitment from the city to fund something. Or so that obligation that you're taking on as a public facing entity should extend beyond your yourself as the kind of linchpin of the plan. And I think that, Leslie, that I just restated what you said in a lot more words.
Well, you're 100% right. And yeah, I agree with that. You can't, you're damaging a lot more than yourself and your own reputation if you don't create a sustainable model. You're really damaging the ecosystem, to use that word that we use a lot.
Absolutely. So I want to jump us into more of that money stuff. I think a lot of times when you don't have a relationship in the nonprofit world, what happens is sometimes the thought process is a little delusional, right? We think, oh, I'll start a nonprofit and then the money will just come in because I've started a nonprofit. And so can you just talk about the difficulty in actually securing that funding, especially through grants for a nonprofit?
May I start on this one? Thank you. Okay. Well, first of all, if you're focused on grants, you're focused on the smallest piece of the pie in the fundraising circle. So I encourage you to start out with a broad focus on how to raise money. Doesn't mean you're going to do it all at once, but if I talk to this grant making organizations first, it is very difficult for startup nonprofits to gain traction with grant making organizations, foundations, if you will. They're called a bunch of things, but they want a track record. They want to know that you're a sound investment. They have responsibilities to their investors as well. This is true also of like donor advised funds, and which is a big deal at the moment. And if you don't know about them, you should. And I shouldn't have said should. You might want to think about it. Starting a nonprofit is a lot of work, and funding is just one piece of the difficult pie, because it's not about just the initial funding. It's about the sustainable funding. And you have to be able to ask people for money. You have to be able, it's not like you have a widget. Now, earned revenue is a good thing, and you can think about that too. But however, that's probably a heavier lift than what you're prepared to do at the beginning. So you're asking people to invest in your vision of a solution to whatever problem it is. And there's lots of ways you can do that, but I use a little acronym, AIM. So you can write this down. You have to have access to those funders. If I had a nickel for every time someone said, hey, let's call Bill Gates, I would be an extremely wealthy woman. So I always say, yeah, sure. Do you know him? Will he take your call? Do you have his number? Because if you do, give it to me. And then 2 is finding the donors that you have access, finding the potential donors that you have access to that have an interest in what you're doing. People have interests, but they're diverse as the individual. They're as unique as a fingerprint, right? Some people want to work in childhood cancer. Some people want to fund STEM education. I mean, you think of it, people want to work in it, but they're not always going to be interested in your thing. And then lastly, do they have the money you need? It's lovely to say to your next door neighbor, hey, will you give me a gift? And they're giving you $10. That's great. $10 is not going to sustain your organization. You have to have a lot of money. And ask anyone who has done this without really planning out. Nisi and I are working with a nonprofit right now that has a great mission and it's viable. She should be in business, but she didn't do the big funding look right up front. And everything Leela just said is what she did. I'll work for nothing. So we're trying to help her redesign her own vision of what this could look like. But it is extremely important that you understand it is not easy to raise money. If it were, everyone would be doing it, and it is not an easy approach.
And I'll just add a couple things to that on the it's not easy side. Some funding sources may require things like audited financial statements, which are expensive, and there are funding sources that LISC utilizes that actually don't fund startup organizations at all, even though they're capacity building funding. So we have an allocation of federal capacity building dollars through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and we don't fund startups. So there is now, whether these are the practices we should be striving for, because I will say that a lot of the practices in this field do make it more difficult for BIPOC-led organizations, for women-led organizations, for folks who are truly, at the grassroots level.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it more difficult for them to move into the viability phase. Whether what we're talking about is the best way for us to be connecting with community, I have my own thoughts about that. And I think, no, we need some changes, but this is the way the field works right now. And I think the second piece of that Leslie just touched on, you may think, well, I'll get a couple of people who are well connected and they'll do all this fundraising work for me. But sometimes it can be harder for someone who's very close, someone who's got a family relationship or a business relationship, to ask someone. You're not the first person to have thought, well, I'll get that person on my board and then they'll go after, insert a name of person here. And so I think to be very clear also with prospective board members or folks that you're recruiting to work in the organization, if you do expect them to play an active role in fundraising, because it may be difficult for them. Someone once told me the closer you are to the money, the harder it is to make the ask at a personal level. So that's just another, I think, piece of that big picture. Oh, this one. Don't get me started on that one. Don't get.
I think all of these are things that we can go into this really deep dive into, which I think is why we'll probably make this at least a quarterly type.
We'll make it a series.
Yeah, because there's so many spaces that we can talk about. I'm just going to really quickly go through a couple of slides. So I'm going to combine some things really quick. You guys talked about, when you first start, it's usually a personal passion project that you start. And then you're like, oh, I can do greater things. And you're not understanding kind of the work that's behind it. And we're talking about money, fundraising, revenue generating. We haven't even touched having competitive salaries right now. Somebody's got to run it. It can't just be you by yourself. And then the other thing that we haven't talked about is maintaining your tax exempt status. There's a lot of rules that are at play when you're a nonprofit. Would either one of you like to speak to that? And then we'll jump into like the management of the nonprofit, like boards and stuff.
Yeah, I can talk to that. So there's sort of two layers of this. Nonprofit status refers to an incorporation status under state law, right? So there's a state requirement for you to file articles of incorporation at the state level as a nonprofit. Then the tax exempt status refers to the IRS federal income tax exemption. So there's a federal requirement. But I say this 1,000 times a day. Neither of them are a business model. They are both status in given to you by the legal entity, either the state or the federal government. You are still a business, and you have to run your business in a fashion that is sustainable, is it goes back to what is a nonprofit that is serving the community, et cetera, all those things we talked about. But I think it's also, you have to be able to know what the guardrails are. If you're a 501c3, as an example, I just read something last night that I was like, I'm not sure this is a C3 when I see it could be a C4, which has some political entity to it around lobbying. John and I spent our lives talking about C3s and C4s and what's the difference. This isn't a tax lecture, so I'm not going to get into it, but there are certain things you can and cannot do based on your tax exempt status from the federal government. And you can run into very deep troubles if you're doing the wrong things on the wrong side of any of those issues. So, but I want to underscore also that when people say I run a nonprofit, I sort of cringe a little bit and I say, you run a business that has a nonprofit status. Because at the end of the day, all of these entities are businesses. So because each of these are soapbox moments for me, so I will stop.
These truly are the conversations we have on a daily basis.
Every day.
Mhm. I think an important thing that you mentioned about advocacy and lobby work is that we all know that taking a council person out to dinner or a congressman, to meeting with them to advocate for a piece of legislation, that sounds like lobbying. But if something is up for a community referendum, like a charter election, you're dealing with a whole different set of activities that could qualify as lobbying activities, because the decision maker in that case is not the elected official, it's the community at large. So these are not, I think, I'm always the first person to say to someone, you should have an accountant, you should have a communications advisor, you should have legal representation, because one of the caveats here is that there are legal liabilities. There are consequences for, and now I sound like I'm giving a real lecture, but there are consequences for not following the rules, and board members can have individual liability. So this is not a minimal. It may be minimal to register as a nonprofit, and to get the status, maintaining it is something different.
Agreed.
Yeah, definitely. So we've kind of hit on some of those barriers or roadblocks. What about the time that it actually takes to build the brand? And I'm just going to flash to the second slide. And also the lack of experience. So when we think about an individual that wants to start a nonprofit, oftentimes the lack of experience is what is kind of the death of the nonprofit. What are some things that an individual that still at this point that wants to start a nonprofit should do before starting a nonprofit, as far as nonprofit management and experience?
Just to say, absolutely be as familiar as possible with the legal and regulatory context, know the difference between the different types of nonprofits. And I think absolutely take a look at the salary surveys and get a sense of what compensation levels are out there. People shouldn't work for you for below market, and they won't in this environment right now. So I can't agree more with Leslie's statement that this is a business. As an example, LISC right now is trying to hire a lender. We're a nonprofit, we're a community development financial institution, but why would you work for LISC doing commercial lending when you could be making twice as much money? And I mean twice as much money work. So if the skills that you need are in high demand, you are not going to be able to consistently underbid the market for that. And you're going to have to figure out how you have a compelling message, and how you become how your entity becomes a trusted partner in achieving your funders' goals. So that, I think that the previous slide about building that relationship, really, to me, a lot of nonprofit management comes down to how you become a trusted partner to the community in fulfilling your mission, but to your funders, whether they're individuals, corporations, or foundations, because all those folks will have different goals. And they will also have different budget formats, and they will also have different funding requirements. So you have to be comfortable with that level of change, of understanding your mission well enough that you can present the pieces of it that are relevant to all of your stakeholders or shareholders.
Excellent. I agree. I have a couple of other things I'd like to add. So there's multiple steps, but there's two, as you're deciding to start a nonprofit, there's two big buckets, and each one has 1,000 steps. So I'm not going to tell you 1,000, don't worry. But before you get to organizational formation, that is like deciding, I'm going to file for a state and federal, I'm going to form a board, I'm going to, all these things. There's the research and planning stage. This is the key to your success. Filing with the IRS is not the key to your success. Doing your homework is the key to your success. And this is where this slide matters, the lack of experience in nonprofit management. If you don't know how to manage all these components, then you're sort of like not even in the ballpark, right? So the first one is, and we've talked about this a little bit already, so I won't harp on this one, but it's start with the questions. Does something exist that's addressing the same needs? Does it serve your area of geographic interest? So maybe there's something that is saving, I'm going to stick with my green dogs, is saving green dogs, but we're here in Texas and it is in Northern California. Okay, but you might want to talk to them, see how it's going. But, and then does the issue you're concerned with interest enough people that you can find board members, governance, you can get funded, there's people interested enough to give you money, and there's enough clients. It's a significant population to serve. If there's only 3 green dogs in your neighborhood or your city that needs saving, go save them yourself. Don't start a nonprofit, like adopt the 3 dogs. And this part, I can't stress any of these parts enough. The other part is gather a team. Do not try to do this by yourself. I agree with Leila 100%. Make sure you have someone that's on your team. It could be your spouse, your uncle, your aunt, I don't care who it is, but someone that understands finances. You need these subject matter experts so accounting and finance, operations, fundraising, programs, communications, legal issues. You need to pull together. You cannot come to this table thinking, I know how to do all of this. Because if you do, wow, I really would like to meet you. But if you're like the rest of us mere mortals, you don't, and it's okay, but don't start this unless you have a clear vision for each of these areas. At the very least, you'll need a board, and that comes under organizational formation, but you need people at a table with you. The state law in Texas requires only 3 board members. If you think you can run a nonprofit with 3 board members, good luck. And then the last piece is really developing your roadmap. So when you do go to funders or you do go to potential board members, there's a clear vision of what you're trying to do. So that roadmap has everything to do with mission and vision, staffing needs, short and long term, operational and programmatic priorities, budget, and a resource development plan. In other words, how are you going to raise those monies? Establishing an accounting system, a record keeping system, blah, blah. I can go on and on and on and on and on. But if you don't have that and you just jump into, I'm going to decide to save the green dog's name, and I'm going to develop this board, but I don't have anything to tell them, and you don't have expectations, and you don't have a clear legal structure. Oh, it's a house of cards. So please do the research and planning part before you do the organizational formation part.
Just to add one thing to that I think the biggest hurdle that we see for folks, and it's experienced organizations as well as new organizations, is that in our world, funds don't arrive when they're committed. And so that could be a congressional earmark that might take 3 years to get to you. But it could also be someone who says, I'll pledge, I'll give you a capital pledge of $1 million, but only if you match it and only when you have matched up to. So that aspect of managing your budget, knowing that some sources are reimbursement only, some sources will only come into play when you're getting matching dollars. To me, that is one of the biggest kind of project management and budgeting hurdles.
Perfect. Awesome.
Great.
All right. I'm moving us through. A lot of us have this, idea. I'll just get volunteers. I'll have people just show up, and, if we're going to keep with the same green dog initiative, not everybody's a dog person. And so, what are you going to do when you can't attract and especially retain those volunteers? Or what does it look like when you don't have a clear job description for them? So I'm gonna have this slide, but I'm also gonna move it to the next one, the difficulty in attracting and retaining. But I also want you guys to talk about what it looks like when you transition from volunteer to professionally led, and you have, your best friend's cousin, sister, uncle volunteering, to needing somebody that actually has dedicated experience in that space. So I'll let either one of you jump in on that.
I would love to say something about this, because this may be the hardest conversation you will ever have. You've had someone who's been a volunteer, who's been a board member, who's done incredible work for the organization, and now maybe the organization is transitioning itself. It's been doing planning work, and now you're having to go out and meet with funders. That volunteer may not be the right person for those asks, because of the way they present themselves, because of the way they understand the mission, because of any one of a number of characteristics, right? The hardest conversation is to sit down with a volunteer and say, you've done such great work for us. At this next phase, I think we should transition chairmanship of this committee to this individual, right? And I'm sure Leslie can address this about firing a volunteer, or how you use volunteers in a way that ultimately may not be as fulfilling to them, but is best for the future of the organization as a whole. And we know that things that volunteers might find very rewarding, like planting trees, there are devices that dig holes and plant trees. Like, we don't actually need people with shovels out there. We don't actually need, sometimes people are volunteering because it feels good to them, but the activities that they're doing are not the best value add for the organization. So now that I've said that uncomfortable thing, I'll let Leslie address it.
Yeah, and it is uncomfortable, but there are ways to get around it. I want to, before I go to that, I want to go to the earlier slide about the finding volunteers. In this COVID world we live in, I was about to say post-COVID, the reality is COVID is still here. We're learning how to live with it, right? So in this world of COVID, volunteerism has undergone a radical change. And I do not use that word lightly. Ask any real volunteer-based nonprofit, think Meals on Wheels, American Red Cross. They rely on volunteers to execute their mission, right? Yes, they have professional staffs. I mean, I was part of the American Red Cross for a really long time, and it's like 10% of the workforce is paid. 90% of all those people you think about going on disasters are volunteers. So, but it's been same as Meals on Wheels. Who has historically delivered the meals? Volunteers. Corporate volunteers, sometimes those things don't barely exist now. It's inching back, but it's going to look different. But now about how do you manage volunteers, and how do you go from volunteer led to professionally led, or just how do you manage volunteers? Nisi said the key word, job description. So treat a volunteer as a staff member. You have two types of staff members. You have a volunteer staff member, and you have an employee staff member. So volunteer, non-paid, paid. They both should have job descriptions. They both should have a reporting structure. They both should have goals and expectations, and they both should be reviewed. So there's no surprises at some point, so that you can create a runway. If you as the leader see, oh, we got to transition this person, you're setting that tone earlier on. Like you can say to that person, hey, your role is really valuable and you are valuable. The organization is growing at such a rate that we are looking now at doing X, Y, and involve them in the conversation. Don't just shove them to the side. Yes, you may have to fire people, and that's okay too, but that's a part of having those ongoing conversations. And if someone is in a volunteer position and they aren't fulfilling the responsibilities, it is okay for you to say, I thank you so much. Your wish to help us was so admirable. We just see that it's not the right fit. Maybe there's a different fit for you in this organization, or maybe it's a different fit for you elsewhere. Celebrate their desire to help, but don't keep them on if it really isn't the right fit. If they can't do the job, don't have them maintain that role. But it is treating them like staff members because they are staffing your organization, maybe not just how the compensation works.
Just to add to that, having an accounting of that, of your volunteer staffing, so that you get a sense, not only that will help you if you decide to transition any of those volunteer positions into a full-time role or a part-time role, a paid role, because then you will understand the actual number of hours and amount of effort that's been put into the position. But it also will help you in showing the depth of support if you can quantify. Now, there's all kinds of issues about, if there's a professional who's donating objects or the product of their work, then there are tax implications for this. But I think just to be able to show a funder the number of hours and the number of positions, so treating them like a staffer, but not paying them,
right?
Yeah, it is key. And I actually want to. I think that leads into this
Yeah.
question about how you measure the impact of services, and we definitely have seen a shift in the whole field, and it's evolving, I think, even more in philanthropy around measuring impact and around working with nonprofits to determine their own measures of impact. There's a whole movement around trust-based philanthropy and funders taking a step back and asking the nonprofit to evaluate and to bring in folks with lived experience to talk about maybe more qualitative impacts. But there are still a lot of folks who are focused on outputs rather than outcomes. And being able to have some output measurements, whether that's being able to count the number of green dogs that you provided food to, the number of green dogs that you spayed and neutered, the number of green dogs that you found homes for, you will need to have some way of, for most funders, you will need to have some way of quantifying your impact. Now, there are some folks out there, high net worth individuals, who are passionate about some particular topic, and they may be willing to write a big check because this is a heart issue for them. But I would say that if you do not do the things Leslie's been specifying, if you're not tracking the work you're doing, if you're not creating these impact measures, you end up in a relationship where you may have a very hard time satisfying the donor, and the donor may be driving the work you're doing, as opposed to you're being able to present the work and find support for it.
I'll underscore that outputs and outcomes are very different things. And I know that Lula said that, and I think it's very important for us to look at serving 500 children is a beautiful thing. If the children need serving and you're providing them with the service that they need, but how did that service serve the community? how did that service move the needle in what those children need? If they're going to be latchkey children, and we see what the problems around latchkey children are. Okay, so the one of the outcomes is 500 children are not latchkey children. And as we track them, maybe your 500 children don't have the same involvement with law enforcement, maybe they don't have the same problems of not excelling in school. Maybe they are excelling and the average latchkey kid does not do as well. Those aren't real statistics. I have no idea. I just made those up. But it's important for us to be able to understand that just serving 500 kids is not an outcome. And it's important that we understand the difference between an output and an outcome.
You know, Leslie, something that we do at LISC is we try to establish the lenses through which we provide services to the community. And we try to include that in a lot of our materials. So we tell folks, we focus on supporting individuals who work for nonprofits, who serve on boards of nonprofits. We provide them with technical support and assistance at the individual level. And outcomes there would be that they're more comfortable in their role or that they feel they have more technical skill. Then we focus on supporting organizations. So that could be grant funding to develop a new capacity or a new service. But we also tell folks we're focused on the system level. So that, in our green dog example, yes, we're supporting green dogs, but then we're trying to figure out why do we have so many stray green dogs in the first place? And right. They're going to be different metrics for each of those levels. And I'm someone who I totally believe this, that we need, if there are people floating down the river, we need to figure out where they're coming from, right? The systems work. But that doesn't mean that we just get to stop pulling people out. Somebody still has to be there pulling folks out while some folks are looking up and going, oh, wait, someone's pushing them off a cliff, right? So it's okay to be focused on different parts of the system, but to be clear with your funders and yourself about which part you're focused on.
Yeah, it reminds me, I spent a big portion of my career in a very odd way in the fire service. And there's an analogy there that I will, and since we always talk about like we're putting out fires, there's the being prepared, right? But you still have to respond. So the preparedness is, can we avoid it? Response, and then recovery. Yeah. And then it's also though, what was the cause? So can we prevent fire? In addition to preparing for fire, right? So it's prevention, it's preparation, it's response, and it's recovery. And those are all true systems in the nonprofit world. I couldn't agree with you more. We can't just worry about why are there people floating down the river and are going to go over the waterfall. We have to save them before they get to the waterfall. But can we build a dam or something? Like, what's the solution to stop the people coming down? So I agree with that. And it is, your role may not be to stop it. Your role may be to only do the rescue and maybe the recovery part. But you want to develop partner organizations, to this slide, that are working on how do we prevent people from falling in the river and going over the waterfall. So it's the preparedness and the preparation, or the prevention and the preparation, sorry, too many P's. And that's where really working within and not against your ecosystem is really important, because there may be partner organizations, but it's hard. And it's hard on both sides. I will say it's hard for new organizations to do that, because what I see, and this is an observed habit, and it's not everyone's, not a blanket statement, but sometimes when we're starting something, you're like, I can do this all by myself. I got this. If someone tells me they've got it, my hair's on fire. That means they don't got it. If they say, I know I'm going to need help with X, Y, and Z, I'm like, that person's got it. But then also how you come to the table, other organizations, it's about trust and it's about the ability to work with you, and you have to come open. And if you're new to the ecosystem, don't pretend for 5 seconds you know all the problems, because you don't. Until it's a lived experience, you're only seeing that there's green dogs. You're not seeing the whole picture. So knowing that you need help, knowing that you do need to establish partnerships. I don't know anyone among us in any nonprofit, in any business period, but that does it alone. No one. Not the big, huge ones. I'll go back to, I work for the American Red Cross and we feed people. We don't prepare the food. The Southern Baptist men prepare the food, or whomever. We deliver the food, but we say we feed people. Well, the Southern Baptist men say they feed people too. It's the partnership that gets the people fed. So
I want to expand on that a little bit, and thinking also about the metrics issue we just had. So if you had 5 groups involved in feeding people, each of them would claim, yes, we fed 1,000 people. Now, did you feed 5,000 people? No, you fed 1,000 people. And each of you were necessary, but not sufficient. So that discussion about how do you measure who actually fed the folks, that's something that I think we are still working out on the giving side, and the in terms of measuring contribution. And that's why I love moving more towards a trust-based model, where you're in conversation and you understand that it's an ecosystem, not a quantity. You didn't each feed 1/5 of a person. But we like to say that our work moves at the speed of trust. So unless you have trusted relationships, and you can't force that, there is a way you can force it if you have enough money. If you have enough money, you can get people to do whatever you want them to do. But if you had all the money in the world, you wouldn't have founded a nonprofit to begin with, most likely. You would be doing your work in other ways. So, I mean, I think it's interesting in saying, framing this as a difficulty. It does take time. It takes time to establish partnerships, and you have to acknowledge that your partners, you have to be meeting an essential goal for them. Your partners have a lot of stuff on their plates. It's not enough just to say, I have good intentions and you should be working with me. You have to fulfill a vital function for them. They are too busy and too overwhelmed with their own work to put a lot of investment into a new organization if you're not vital and helpful to the work that they're doing.
agreed. Where do you want us to go next, Nisi? Are you talking? You're on mute now.
I need my shirt. You're on mute.
You're on mute.
I was saying I have like 360 notes, sticky notes on my desk from where I'm trying to take in all of the key points that you guys have mentioned. I want to ask our guest, our attendees, drop in the chat, which space do you feel like we could have a whole nother episode on, or that you would be most interested in learning? The research and planning part, like the actual literal steps that you would do before, the financial part, sustainability, how to finance, grants, funding, things of that nature. The management, or like the knowledge of nonprofit, like how to be a nonprofit leader, or the ecosystem. And you can always say all. So that would be the research and planning, the financial component. It would be the I just lost my train of thought. Research and
organizational formation, that
Thank
part.
you. Organizational formation, like the operations day to day, the management part, or the how do I work with different partners within the community? While you're thinking of that, I want to give our 2 panelists an opportunity to give you guys some final thoughts or key takeaways, and then we will open it for any questions that you guys have.
Go ahead, Leela. You please.
Yeah,
go.
I'll add that the best advice I got, the last one before this nonprofit that I was running, one of my great board members and a volunteer doing a lot of work on the ground said, look, nonprofit work is like falling in love, and not in the way that you think. it's, you can't tell people who to fall in love with. And people are going to fall in love with different people, which is great. But just because you feel that your cause is compelling and fabulous and the best cause in the world, the world is, as, and Leslie's already made this point, there are lots of folks who couldn't care less about your cause. And so, you know, figuring out how to be an advocate without, you know, walking that sort of fine line of recruiting people, bringing people who are like-minded into your organization without slipping over into the kind of righteous anger component of nonprofit organizing. And because you are going to have to see where you fit in the bigger picture. And that means understanding that while your organization is incredible and essential and doing great work, that there are lots of other organizations and entities out there. And to some level, it means not taking all of this personally. So you have to be personally committed enough to be crazy to start your own nonprofit, but not to take it personally as you try to grow this organization and put it out in the community.
So true. And I would say, you know, there's so many components of starting a nonprofit that, you know, we can have seminars on each of them. And, you know, I really talked about the research and planning, and that for me is my big deal. But I will say that probably the second biggest deal is developing your board, because that can make or break you. And there's, as we spoke about earlier, there's a huge they are the legally accountable entity, and that's a big dang deal. But recruiting your board is such an important component, and do not take it lightly. It's more than just putting, to use the vernacular, butts in a seat, right? It is more than just, oh, the state says I need 3 people, I'll find 3 people. No, you can't just start with, I mean, you can start with 3 people, but you're going to have to ramp up pretty quickly. Think about diversity, and diversity is more than race and gender. You know, it is across the spectrum. It's what kinds of professional experience do they have? You want those subject matter experts on your board. If you don't have a staff person to run your books, you better have an accountant on your board, you know, that can do it for you. If you have to be clear on expectations go both ways. What do you expect from the board, but what can the board expect from you and other staff if you have them, and each other? Start small and grow your board incrementally. Boards are a lot to manage, so that's a whole nother slice of your pie. You know, when you're starting out, very often you're doing a lot as the founder, and your board is something that you have to manage. So I will use that just as a topic. There's a million other things I think are important, but we've talked on most of them today. But beyond doing your upfront homework before the formation of an organization, doing your research and your planning, I would say get that board as strong as you can. I'm watching also the chat. I love this. Veronica, we are going to have like minds. First of all, you like 80s music. Way to go. And oh, is Veronica even on? No.
Yeah,
oh yeah, you
yeah,
are. You are. I see you now. Sorry. And governance, and board work and funding. Yeah. Governance, that's probably why I just talked about boards, because that's such an important thing. But, and Louisa, thank you for mentioning management and ecosystem, and Beth, financial component. Yep. Finances are so important. Not just how you raise the money, but how you manage the money. So it's that 2 sides of the same coin. It's the income, and then it's the expenses. How do you spend it? And yes, you can have a budget surplus, and you should always plan a budget that has a surplus, and you roll it in. And then what you do with that, have a plan, have your board enact a plan for those surpluses.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to build off of that, that notion of the budget surplus and specifically Beth's interest in how are you keeping the money engine idling instead of rebuilding it every cycle. And I think making sure that your board and your funders know that your goal is to build a sustainable organization, that you're here for the long haul, and that means charging adequate overhead. No one should be trying to utilize, no funder now should be focused exclusively on percentage overhead as the key ingredient in determining whether you're a fundable organization or not. But that old saw comes up over and over again, how much you're spending on overhead. And that will vary greatly. If you're an organization that mainly does advocacy, you're going to be spending a lot more on overhead than an organization that's, you know, providing direct services. So that will come up. I think the other thing that will come up, that's a message we need to communicate around your, because you said, how do you work with your donor base? What messages do you give them? So I would advise against competing with other nonprofits on the basis of we only spend 3% on overhead, because that's not sustainable. And we also personally advise against saying, you know, that our board's primary responsibility is fundraising, because as we move more towards that every board member's primary responsibility is fundraising. I should phrase it that way. As we move more towards trying to engage board members with lived experience, there are some board members who are contributing. It's almost like the widow's mite story, right? So $5 from one board member may be a really significant contribution that they are balancing with a lived experience perspective on the issue that you're addressing. And so that understanding of where resources come from and how they're expended, that it's not all about expending the least you can and getting the most you can out of a board member, I think is something that should be communicated to donors on a more regular basis.
Agreed, completely.
We have just a couple of more minutes. I can tell you now that we will definitely be doing this in a series. We wanted to cast a really wide net to kind of see what people wanted to hear about, what they wanted to know. I'm with you on the title. I just feel like it's a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing. And so you just be on the lookout. You guys will get the recording today. It'll just kind of be the raw cut recording today. And then each of the individuals will also share their contact information in case you want to get in touch with them. And if you have any questions, I'm going to turn the recording off so we can have kind of a private thing. And if you want to have questions, this way you don't have to worry about your question popping up on YouTube in 6 months from now. So hold on one second. Let me turn the recording off.